What's up everyone, Lance Hedrick here, and today we're going to talk about the Kafatek Monolith Max 2. The only reason I do these kind of end-game grinder and machine videos is because there is so much we can learn about coffee when doing them. It's these companies that are spending tons of money on R&D and that have these more expensive equipment that are doing some of the most exciting innovations. It's a nice thing to understand and take lessons from things like this for us to better understand grinder theory, what's happening between the burrs with fracture theory and different things like that. Manufacturers have taken some of the things I've discussed from these grinders in the past and applied it to things that are a bit more budget friendly. We'll start off by just talking about what this grinder purports to offer. Then we're gonna dial in espresso. We'll talk about the workflow, we'll talk about some of the pros and the cons of the setup itself. Then we'll open the grinder up, look at the pre-breaker, we'll switch out the burrs to do some coarse burrs in order to play with filter. After that, I'm gonna talk about a lot of different burrs, so we're gonna have a big burr chat there, so if you wanna skip to that, you can. Then following that, I'll have concluding thoughts, and then we'll end the video there. There will obviously be discussions that are like a typical review of whether or not people in the market would want this grinder, but a lot of it will be laden in kind of things that I've learned about grinding and things that I think this can do or might be innovative in that help us understand grinding in general. Why do you have two grinders? Well, this one is the Monolith Max 1. It is what was released prior to this. This one is on loan from a friend that goes by Atonic on Discord. He reached out and said, "Do you want to borrow my Monolith Max 1?" And I was like, "Absolutely I do." And so he sent this out to me. I've been using it for somewhere around 8 or 9 months, maybe longer, I don't know. All I know is I keep getting asked, when is the video coming? So the video is here. I bought this one at full price, $3,600, and had it shipped to me here in Portugal, and I've been using this since like February or March or so. I've used it quite a bit. Now, these more expensive grinders, I tend to use them a lot more before I do a review because, well, there's essentially a lot more at stake, and there's just a lot more to kind of understand, a lot more nuances, a lot more burr sets. I'm not saying that the cheaper grinders I don't put a ton of effort into, but obviously when it comes to these, it's just a bit different. Kafatek was founded in, I think, about 2012, about 12 years ago, in Seattle, Washington. Since then, they've been producing grinders. Now, they have a pretty small repertoire of what they're actually doing. I believe they just have one cone burr grinder, that's like a dual cone. They have a 75 millimeter flat grinder, and then they have this Max, which is 98 millimeters. What's interesting about Kafatek is they build everything on this grinder in-house with exception of the motor, which comes from Japan. I'll link below what the motor actually is. I believe it's 200 watt, but it's BLDC motor that is stepped down from 4,000 RPM to 400 RPM using a 10-to-1 gear system. There's a big misunderstanding I've noticed with grinders and grinder reviews in general, and I've probably given Sue some of this in past reviews over a year ago or so, especially when it comes to these BLDC type motors. If you're using a gear system, you'll get more than enough torque, hence the niche duo being a 120 watt motor being able to grind through something like green coffee. They only ship a few batches a year. You have to get them pre-orders. It's kind of difficult. People end up sometimes selling their pre-order in order for other people to get in line because it's a big waiting game. And if you're not quick, you can miss out on it and you might be waiting 6 months to a year in order to get your grinder. Some people may place an order in October for a February dispatch, but then January comes along and there is a new feature on the grinder, but they've already ordered, they're getting the old stock because, well, small businesses, you have to work like that. You can't just switch everything out right when you announce a change. It's only from that point forward that the new one is in effect. So that has annoyed some people, but it makes sense to me. There's no way to juggle the inventory in a way that makes sense to where everyone's going to be pleased. So I do like this idea of continually trying to improve your grinder, and the fact that most of it is retrofittable is very nice as well. I've read online that the tolerances are within 10 microns on everything. That would be very impressive if true. I can't say if it is or is not, but what I can say is I've been very impressed by the build quality of this. It is put together incredibly well, and you know that the person behind it is definitely type A when it comes to making sure everything fits perfectly together. As I've said, this is a 98 millimeter flat burr grinder that has a pre-breaker inside that is actually inspired by conical burrs. So the beans come in through this funnel, down through the pre-breaking cone burr, into the flat burrs, and then out through this nozzle. Normally these single dose grinders that have a variable RPM setting, the lowest they go is around 400. This one goes from 5, literally 5, which is way slower than hand grinding, up to 400. Now I wouldn't recommend going to 5. I wouldn't recommend doing 30. It's an option, I guess, if you really wanted to play with it, but I don't see why you would want 5 minutes to grind your beans. Just kind of twist it, and you click it in order to lock in what RPM you want down to the 10th of an RPM, which is really neat. It's very granular and it's very accurate. Now, in addition to that, there is a switch down here that puts in standby mode, which can be flipped when you get your grinder. So if you receive one and it's not working, maybe the standby is switched on. And another switch down here that reverses the direction of the motor. The reason it has this is because the shuriken burrs that are made in-house intentionally spin the opposite direction of typical burrs. In fact, I don't know of any other 98mm grinder that uses the same direction spinning as the shuriken burrs do. So that does take away the opportunity for people that already have 98mm grinders and want to buy these burrs to try out, unless you have the capability of modding your P100, which I believe some people have done in order to reverse spin. You're kind of SOL. They do have a switch on here because BLDC's direction can be changed. With that, you can switch it and you could place other burrs in. Before you get excited, it does have that pre-breaker I talk about, and there's no way to switch out that burr because that is a unidirectional burr as well. So when you put beans in, there's no way for it to get caught into the grooves and cracked. So you can't just switch the motor direction on this, use something else. In fact, currently I have SSP cast 98mm burrs in here that do a great job, and I have it just reversed spinning. Because of the motor in here, you can actually play with the acceleration speed. Now, this is an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people realize. I think there's a capability in the Akai Orbit to do a limited version of it, and then on the Ultra, you can do this as well. But essentially, you can play with the acceleration of the motor from 0.5 to 15 seconds. What that means is you can say, I want this to be a peak of 200 RPM, but I want it to take 15 seconds to get there. So if you hot load it, you can have it go slower and slowly accelerate so that there's not a frenzy of jumping beans if it accelerates to full speed immediately. This is not necessarily something to play with as much with this new one due to its pre-breaker, but on the predecessor or ones without that pre-breaking cone, it is definitely an interesting thing to kind of play around with to take away some of that chaos and to give it a bit more uniformity of feed into the burrs themselves. This grinder is set at 30 degrees. Why 30? I'm not quite sure. I'm sure that there is something about bearing and the load inside of it that it needs to be at 30 degrees, or it was designed to be at 30 degrees for that. I do know that there are some people who have added a modification in order to tilt it more, or you can do the simple arm trick where essentially you unscrew two of these screws and you can tilt it and kind of tighten it for pressure against the body. I'm not recommending officially you do that at your own risk, but to incline it more to like 45 degrees, something like the Weber EG1. Thumbs wide open. With thumbs wide open. Yeah. Now, when the burrs are spinning below 200 RPM, there's not enough really centrifugal force created in order to eject the particles out of those burrs and into your dosing cup. So you'll be grinding and they just kind of want to stick in there. When you tilt it more, you get more aid from gravity, and it really helps push that process along. Kafatek definitely doesn't recommend this and probably will not be pleased about me talking about it, but it is something I've seen online, and since it's online anyway, I figured it was something to bring up. Now, there is a purge button on this new iteration, but the fact that it tops out at 400 RPM, you're not really going to get much from the purge, especially if you're already grinding at 400 RPM. It's literally not changing the speed at all. Dennis created this 3D printed little holder that can be fit into the portafilter forks to fit specifically the blind shaker. The nozzle is like a silicone kind of rubbery material, which is kind of annoying to clean sometimes. With it, when you're done, you can kind of sit here and thwack away at it. What I've noticed is when you use the bellows properly and you do it well enough, you don't really need the thwacker. People come in and see this, and it's very interesting to them, and they're always curious what it is because it does sort of look like a microscope, which is pretty neat because when you think about grinding, you're thinking of these tiny particles, which you'd need a microscope to see. And so it tends to be a question people often have when they come in to studios. Wait, what is that? And it's always fun to kind of talk about the grinder because of that. The ugliest thing about it, without question, is the Mr. Puffer on top. Without it, it's not nearly as bad, but I have noticed I absolutely need RDT for it, and I have to bellow quite a bit every time. All right, so we've got 20 grams dosed out. I have it on an espresso fine level. I set it to 250 RPM. Now, I could show you at 400 to show you the fastest it can grind, but I wanted to show you the efficacy of the purge. So we're gonna take a look at this, kind of see how long it takes to grind. Noise level is really nice. It's not too loud, not whiny. But anyway, let's go ahead and RDT it because that is necessary. 2 nice squirts. I'm gonna shake it up. Then we'll start the grinder to hot load. Now with this one, I haven't seen any stalling. This one I had a ton of stalling even when it was fully seasoned with lightly roasted coffees. And they even warn of that potentially happening if a coffee bean gets stuck perfectly between the beans because tolerances are so tight between the shaft and the carrier, it could stall. But anyway, let's dump this in, hot loaded, 250 RPM, and here we go. So here at the end, I'm gonna hit purge and you can watch how much comes out. Not very much, just a lot of chaff essentially. All right, so now that that's over, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it off. So you can see even with RDT, there is still some chaff and flyaways here. There's always gonna be static with these bigger burrs. So trying to figure out a way to do it other than a deionizer inside is a bit difficult, even with RDT, unless you wanna put a ton. But the more water you put on it, the more potential it will have to stick inside the funnel. Now I've read online that some people use their finger to kind of push those beans out. I do not recommend doing that. Instead, you can invest in one of these little camera lens and I just kind of stick it in and I'll puff it at the end of the grind. So you hear there are little bits that are getting ground up now. Now they do have the Mr. Puffer itself. It kind of like distorts as you push down. What I like to do is fill the hole with the camera lens cleanser, and then with this together, it's much more effective, and I can get down lower with the tip of that kind of double bellow action. The double bellow. You know, once you have it fully bellowed, there's just a little bit that comes out. Maybe that's like 0.03 of a gram. It fits just on my finger. Whenever I was running tests with this, because I rely on really precise dose in, dose out, what I would do is run it at 400 RPM so I didn't have to purge at the end. I would take this right inside and immediately would start puffing from away in order to dislodge anything that may be stuck against the walls. And then I would kind of puff up and down both at the same time, double puffing. You have to kind of prod them out. On the older one, they had this more limited number system and you had to rely on stickers and just kind of assuming where you were at, which was a lot more painful. But now they've made a great decision of putting the sticker here onto the actual housing of the grinder, and then you can just move it around and there's numbers all the way around the grinder itself. So that when you're going to filter and back, you have 360 degrees worth of numbers, which is a massive improvement and such an easy thing to change. It is of utmost importance to run the grinder though as you go from coarse to fine. If you don't do that, you can likely have some issues because coarse particles can still be in those burrs and cause some issues. You can actually get to roughly where you want to be with your espresso shot, and then you can kind of further dial in with small changes on the RPM, which is kind of a unique way to dial in and can change how you approach some different coffees. That's something that Fancy Basket Boy Sprobert in the EAF Discord does. All right, we got that espresso pulled, and here we go. Let's take a little sip. Ooh, that is acidic. That is syrupy, acidic, and it's pretty nice. There's kind of this fear behind opening your Kafatek, and a big part of it is this massive yellow sticker here that says, "This is a high-precision grinder assembled with great care. Do not disassemble," all caps. "Do not remove funnel," all caps. Please read the manual. If you open it and after that there's an issue, they don't want it to be on them, and that makes sense. But opening your grinder and cleaning it is pretty necessary, especially if you make a lot of coffee. I'm not Kafatek. Whatever you do, do at your own risk, avoiding warranty, whatever, but I've opened them both a million times and it's been absolutely fine. Now, something you want to be absolutely certain of is that these two back pins, these are aligning pins, you do not misplace these, okay? So they go into the top here and they go right back here. You cannot mess with those. Do not lose them. And as you're cleaning it out, be very careful to not allow grounds to get into these screw holes because, you know, it could mess with the evenness of pressure going down on it. So just be very careful when you're opening it up. Now, right at top, you're gonna see that outer cone burr and the inside cone burr for the pancakes. But what I'm gonna do is take off this burr carrier, just like so. And as you can see, we have some retention right here where the feeding is going, where the pre-breaking is happening. Now we can see the inside. And as you can see, there's actually a chunk of coffee right here on top of the screw hole. Now this is actually a great example of why screw holes suck. If you got your burr in and it had a chunk out of one of the teeth, would you think that's defective? Would you be confident that it changes the taste of your coffee? All right, well, let's just apply that logic to 3 massive holes in your brewing geometry structure. Let's think about that. But also, yes, it does change it quite a bit. You open up a lot more surface area. You have a lot more cutting area for the beans to go through that is more controlled. That little screw hole is going to cut the bean a bit. It's going to crush it a bit. And as you see, it has quite a bit of retention, and there's this big old block of coffee that's stuck on it. So now we kind of look at this pancake burr. Now what you're seeing here is it's like a flattened pre-breaker section of a cone burr, which is a really great way of doing it. So essentially you have the collar right here to kind of crack the beans as it's being fed through. So it kind of meets the feeding into the burrs as it goes through. You have this tiny little auger right here. It's very small auger. I'm not sure how effective it is, but it does seem to be doing something because as you can see here, a little bean got stuck in the auger. Here's a picture I took with my phone after I took one of the burrs out just to see how effective this cone burr was at breaking those beans. So as you can see, they're really big chunks. They're very few fines. It does a really good job at just breaking them up, which is something I'm really into. I think pre-breakers are necessary on these bigger burrs, and this is a nice way of going at it without having to rely on a vertically mounted burr set that has a big pre-breaking auger, which I think is definitely a step up from the one here, which doesn't have a pre-breaker or feeder system at all. It kind of has little fingers that kind of scoop the beans into the burrs, but for the most part, you're just full out sending the dose into the burrs. I still think that there's a big improvement when you slow feed on this because the pre-breaker does such an efficient job. It's so quick to break it. Essentially what happens is when you're grinding, it breaks all of them very quickly, and then they kind of just sit here and wait to go through the burrs themselves. But let's go ahead. I'm going to pull the burrs off. These are the SSW burrs. For those of you who are worried that I'm showing trade secrets, I did get permission from the man himself, so it's all good. But anyway, we're going to go ahead, unscrew these, and bada bing, bada boom. And he does recommend to use a proper wrench with a specific Newton meter in order to make sure you're not over tightening because it can cause some warping. And then this bottom burr is actually very, very tightly put in here. It's good for alignment, it's good for the tolerance there, but it can be a bit of a pain to get out. So let's vacuum that out and then we'll pull the burr out. It's not like the P100 where I have to use a hair dryer in order to expand the aluminum to pop it out, so that's good, but it does take a little bit of skill in order to get it out. So you can take like an Allen wrench or something, you can just slowly start to wiggle each side. I like to grab one of the holes with one finger and just kind of leverage it from inside the screw hole on the opposite side. Now, as you can see, nothing on the bottom side, nothing really in the chamber itself. You got a little bit of caking on the sides, but nothing too unexpected. We can kind of get the rest of the stuff out by just kind of sweeping it down through the exit hole. Somehow grounds can get under this top burr, and I'm not really sure how. I'm sure this will be a fix that'll come in a future iteration or even an add-on that you can kind of shove underneath the burr to ensure it's flush so that that doesn't happen, because that can affect the alignment. All right, and so in the end, this is essentially all the retention you have. It looks like a lot when it's splayed out on the counter, but in reality, it's really not a lot. I'll even include the bean in there. You add the bean in there, it's probably solidly at 0.6, a little over. But a lot of that is not going to be transition from grind to grind. Like the stuff underneath the burr, it's obviously not going anywhere. Once it's there, it's there. Now, as part of their QC process, they actually sent me a video of them measuring the alignment with a Zeiss CMM, and it shows that the perpendicularity and flatness was within 2 microns. So, of course, I pulled out my dial indicator in order to verify, and sure enough, as you can see on screen, it's hard to get a perfect 360 without hitting a divot of a screw hole, and so that little dip as it hits the very little ridge of one of the screw holes. I will say you might need to align the top burr just because you're relying on these springs and the compression of the 4 screws going into it in order to have that alignment, but that's a simple marker process if you feel the need. I've not actually done it. As you saw when I took mine out, I found that the coffee was more than adequate without having to do anything like that. I did want to note that when replacing your burrs or putting the burrs back in, it is recommended, and I'd recommend as well, to use shims around the edges on this outer burr and then shims on the inside in order to just make sure you set it perfectly radially. These, I think, are largely unnecessary for these new grinders. Now, I understand these are being sold to fit the old ones as well, and there's no pre-breaker, but if this is going to be the new iteration with this pre-breaking cone on top with the pancake burr, I think a redesign is called for in order to have more finishing teeth space. Currently, the longest finishing teeth I'm aware of is on the compact PK100 that has about 1 centimeter finishing teeth. If we could spread out the love on that face, I think the grind particle distribution and the heat damage would be a lot different. So what's happening now is after it hits this cone burr, it's causing big chunks, and then it's being fed into these pre-breakers that are big enough for beans, but don't need to be. If these were bevied off more or had a little bit, less of an inclination to it, in order to start cutting it sooner, as opposed to letting it kind of rumble around and overload the finishing teeth, then I think we could have something really nice on our hands. All right, so we've got the coarse burrs back in there. We've got our coffee dosed out, water heated up. So let's go ahead, dump the beans in, and then here we go. Now, because those beans start where that cone is, it's almost impossible for it to really get stalled. I guess it could stall up that cone because that initial bit needs a lot of torque, but I've yet to have this one stall for me. But anyway, that's grinding filter. At 250, obviously it's gonna take a little while. Now I'm gonna hit the purge, which just again goes up to 400. All right, now obviously there's less left over whenever it's this coarse grounds than it is with espresso, but still worth thwacking and puffing. Now what I'm gonna do now is a little bougie. You don't have to follow me at home, but this has a lot of chaff in the coffee, so I'm gonna pour it out on this tray and blow the chaff away. And now look at it, chaff-free, baby. All right. Now to explain the burrs, I'll start with this flow chart that is floating around the Kafatek forum that kind of describes the different burrs and their intention or their intended use as they were designed. They have 4 different burrs that are offered that are built in-house and designed by Dennis himself, and these are called MD for medium dark, so the Shuriken medium dark. You have the Shuriken light medium, you have the Shuriken coarse, and the Shuriken sweet. So the top of the flowchart says, do you want an all-around burr? Something that can do filter, can do espresso, can do dark and light, kind of do everything well. If it's a yes, then you do the Shuriken light medium. If it's a no, then it asks, do you want light or dark roast, or like light medium or medium dark roast? If you want medium dark, you go with the medium dark burrs. If you want light medium, then it asks one more question. What type of ratio do you like? Do you want those really small ristretto style shots? If so, get the light medium. If you want the longer shots, 1-3, 1-4, then get the sweet. I think that is a helpful breakdown, but I would like to talk a little bit more about my experience with these burrs. I have not been shy that my favorite 98mm burr for brewing is the brew burrs from Titus or SSP. They're a little different iterations, but I prefer the Titus ones. They're a little older geometry, of a bit bigger outfall. They cannot do espresso like at all, but they make really, really incredible tea-like, super complex, super nuanced, just delicious brews for my palate. Now, not everyone shares that, and that's fine. They also show any defect the coffee has, so it's a very small window to get a really nice coffee. Now with the coarse burr, it is not quite as intense of clarity and flavor separation as these are to me. It's not as tea-like or anything like that. It has the body of something like the HU at 98mm produces, but it has a lot more clarity and not as much sharp acidity as that HU can kind of give you. So it has a really nice presentation of acidity. It's got a really rounded mouthfeel. It has a great aftertaste. It does just a fantastic job. Well, the pre-2015 EK43 is great, but those are impossible to find. They're not made anymore, and they tend to have defects, like some of them can be warped because how they're made. The coarse burrs make filter coffee easy. Whether you're doing a light roast, medium roast, dark roast, you put it in there and it does a good job. Now with the light medium, it seems to produce a decent amount of fines, something similar to what the EK43 does with its stock burrs. That's actually the closest in taste that I can think of when I'm trying to compare this to other 98mm burrs. It has a big sweet spot. It is a bit smoother with a bit bigger window of dialing in than the EK43 post-2015 cast burrs are. Even though the geometry is way different, they're somewhat similar, though I would say for the average user, these are much more forgiving. They give you a really nice acidity, but it's not an intense acidity like the HU from SSP. It's not as punchy and it doesn't have that kind of harshness that you might get. Nowhere near as clear as HU or obviously as the brew burrs, but it gives you a really nice body. It gives you a nice acidity, a nice texture, gives you nice sweetness. It's round. It's an easy all-around burr. As far as its filter capabilities, because of that fast feeding is what I'm speculating, and the extra production of fines, it does give you a bit more of a murky body when it comes to the actual brew itself. They make good brews. They're not, ace brews is what I'm trying to get at. They're similar to the filtered coffees that the core Burrs on the Weber EG1 kind of can give you. What the core is for me in the 80 millimeter world is what the LM is for me in the 98 millimeter world. It was the EK43 Burr as far as something that was an all-rounder. It could do filter pretty well. It could do espresso well. Had a nice sweet spot. People wanted EK shots because you got that kind of texture. And a lot of that is because they're cast Burrs. These are not cast, but I think they give you an experience similar to that with a bit better perception of the acidity. Not that these are higher acidity, but they give you a better experience of that acidity on your palate. The sweetness is maybe a bit higher in the EK43, but overall in every other area, I kind of give the scores to the LM. Very flexible, very easy. Now these are recommended to be used at really short ratios, so like a 1-to-1, a 1-to-2, and then they say that over that you should get the sweet Burrs. I've actually found that these do well above that ratio as well. Whereas it's fun to explore the high extraction, really low yield shots. They're not really my bag, man. And I don't think that the texture suffers too much when you extend it a lot more. And in fact, if you really know what you're doing, you can get some decent texture past that 1-to-2. Of course, that's not what they're made for, but I do know that they do a great job. And I know some people who swear by doing much bigger ratios, even up to a 1-to-7 on espresso. Is that even espresso anymore? I don't know. It's more like soup. If I'm wanting my high clarity kind of soup style shots, I much prefer the HU Burrs from SSP or the Brew Burrs from SSP or the LU Burrs from SSP. Those, if I'm wanting high clarity and intense acidity, those give me more so what I'm looking for. It's kind of like if you were thinking in terms of shapes, you would have more of the top of an oval, so it's like almost an angle, almost a complete curve you would have with the LM Burrs. With the HU Burrs, they're kind of more of a triangle. They're really intense. They're not really very forgiving. It's like you get that punchy acidity, you get that really intense clarity, you get that separation, but the sweetness in the body can be kind of lacking, a bit hollow, and it doesn't really extend as much, whereas this one kind of has a better extending type of finish. With the sweet Burrs, what you're going to get is kind of something that SSP doesn't really have in its area. You would think these are kind of replicating the Ditting Lab Sweets, which a lot of people love. I enjoy quite a bit. And SSP has their own version of the Lab Sweet casts, which I currently have in this Max 1. But even with that, there is almost too much of a target for acidity with them that it takes away from some of that sweetness. And because all this is about perception of sweetness, right? We don't have enough sugar content in coffee to actually perceive of sweetness from sugar. It's more about the perception of all the different flavors playing along each other. And with this Burr, I'm getting incredibly sweet shots at the 1-to-1.5 range, all the way up to like 1-to-5. They do an okay job with body. It suffers a bit there, but the sweetness is really immaculate, and it tones down some of the harsh acidity that you'll get from a lot of these SSP options, which are usually my MO. Doesn't really have a counterpart with SSP. I guess the closest would be the cast Burrs, but if you could tone the acidity down a bit and the harshness down a bit, then you would have something closer to this. The filter from the SSW, though, I think is a bit better than the ones from the SLM. They're a bit cleaner. They're not as exciting as perhaps the pre-2015 EK43 Burrs, which I have right here. They're not as good as the coarse Burrs, but if you really dial in and spend a lot of time, you'll be able to get something that's, 70, maybe 80% of the way to their coarse Burrs that I currently have housed in here. They don't quite hit as much layering and complexity as I might want, but they give you a nice brew. The sweet spot is a bit smaller for it because that's not really what they're made for, and it's much bigger on the coarse Burrs, but in the end, you're getting a nice filter, so that's a good dual-purpose Burr in my opinion. They actually have a similar inclination on the inside going to the outside to that of like the LU 98mm or the HU 98mm. It has a similar thickness on that initial pre-breaker as does the sweet Burrs. So far with all the different Burr manufacturers, the only ones I've had really great experiences with have been Hemro or Ditting for the most part, and SSP of course. And so it's really nice to know these are out there. Again, it's a shame they don't fit in other grinders, which again I understand because when it's a small company you want to kind of keep things so it can't be replicated, but they are really nice, and since this is really the only grinder that can use them, it kind of forces you into that ecosystem similar to how Apple does the stinking plug that can only work with theirs, whatever. I know they've switched over, but for years it was like that. Now Now, these burrs are said to come pre-seasoned prior to coating, so you shouldn't really need to do anything. They also run like half a pound through before shipping it to you. And they also calibrate it and they pull a shot. And they send you this nice little sheet of paper. Monolith test report for Lance. And so it tells you what grind setting they used, what basket they used, how they pulled their shot, and what the extraction percentage is in order for you to kind of know that these are high-performing burrs. So they always want to do a really high extraction just to show that they can, not necessarily that they should. Even though they're said they're pre-seasoned, I have found that you need quite a bit of seasoning with these burrs in order to lessen the static and to improve the cut profile. But with the LM and the SSW, which was actually on a pre-used grinder, I found the need to do a little bit more seasoning in it, and it opened up even more. All three burrs that I've seen, and I can only imagine the MD is similar, all of them have 9 pre-breakers. I know the SSW or the Suite used to have 6 pre-breakers, and at some point they went to 12, but now they're at 9 with version 3, and this was to improve the feed rate or the speed of the grinding. They used to take like 50 seconds to grind because they only had the 6 pre-breakers. It took forever to slowly feed them through, which was actually a design decision in order to slowly grind the beans. But the moving up to the 9 pre-breakers helped improve that to like a 20-second grind. So you still have a long grind time with these grinders, but I mean, when you're doing these expensive grinders, hopefully the number one thing in your mind is not speed, because, well, you're not going to get it with this. You're better off with the P100 if that's what you want. But speaking of the P100, and speaking of my experience with other in-game grinders, quote unquote, all of them have some flaws you have to work around. And I know that's super annoying. A lot of people say, God, I'm paying like $5,000. I shouldn't have any flaws. And I understand that sentiment. But the reality is, all of them have their own little flaws. The P100 doesn't stall. It doesn't stall ever. It has very low retention. You don't really need to use bellows. It has a much faster RPM so that when it's purging, it's actually super effective. The knocker is not very great, but it can get it out. I prefer the taste out of this, but workflow on this is honestly pretty bad. I usually prefer using the EG1 when doing videos because it is the most consistent with having to faff around as far as the dial, as far as the retention. I can weigh in 20.05 or so using my Pixis scale and expect to get almost exactly 20.01, 20.02 out of the grinder without having to use bellows or anything. But I've always been a huge proponent of taste over workflow. Some people disagree with that. I don't know why you'd be buying a $4,000 grinder if it wasn't for optimal taste. You can get great workflows for much cheaper. So in my opinion, if you're buying one of these grinders, you're better off just staying in the Shuriken world unless you really want to try something outside of it. And I think they're built really well. You can play with the acceleration, you can play with the speed, variable speed. You have 98mm burr options. You can switch the motor, and you can take out the pre-breaker in order to fit other 98mm burrs in there. Holy cow, that was a long video. If you made it this far, you are my favorite. And there's probably like 12 of you. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you learned some things in this video, not only about the Monolith and what it's doing, and some of its cons, some of its pros, but hopefully you picked up something new. Hopefully talking about the heat, or talking about the particle distribution, or talking about the feeding, or the pre-breaker, or the burr geometry, anything like that. Hopefully that was helpful, that you learned something, and if you did, consider hitting the like, hitting the subscribe. All that helps me so much. I have my Instagram, my Facebook, my second YouTube all down below. Usual pandering stuff. But that's about it for today. So, without further ado, I hope that you brew something tasty today. And cheers.